Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome here to the Geneva Press Club. Welcome to all those who follow us on Zoom, those who follow us on our website, www.pressclub.ch, and you can also watch this on YouTube as well as on Facebook Live. Today we are going to have a press conference about the killing of Shireen Abu Akleh, who was shot 11th of May in Jenin. And we are going to listen to the Al Jazeera. She was a reporter for Al Jazeera, so we will have the director of Al Jazeera that will talk. We will have representative of journalist organizations, and we will have also here the niece of Shireen Abu Akleh. So as you know, there were many reports that were done about this killing. There were media reports who stated that the bullets issued from Israeli forces. There was also a report for the Human Rights Council that came to the same conclusions. On the Israeli side, they still have other views and still wait for an international or an inquiry. So this is the topic we are going to discuss today, and we are going to start directly with Gilles Trendle. Gilles Trendle is the managing director of Al Jazeera English, and he joins us by Zoom. Gilles, can you hear us?
Yes, Pierre, thank you very much.
Welcome here. So I give you right away, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Pierre, and thank you, everybody. It's been 51 days since our colleague, our dear colleague, Shireen Abu Akleh, was killed by the Israeli military in the city of Jenin in the occupied West Bank. The question stands, are we getting any closer to achieving justice for Shireen? Shireen, a Palestinian citizen, an American citizen, is commonly described as somebody who was a brave and kind reporter. She was devoted to reporting on the struggles of ordinary Palestinians in a career spanning nearly 3 decades. Shireen was killed on May the 11th for doing her job. She was killed because she wanted to give a voice to the residents of Jenin and to all Palestinians who live under the heavy yoke of occupation. Shireen was shot in the back of the neck in the relatively small space between the blue flak jacket, clearly emblazoned with the word press, that she was wearing, and the blue helmet she had on, commonly worn by journalists. In other words, she was shot while in full protective press gear, clearly identifying herself as a journalist. A growing body of independent reports have found that Shireen was killed by Israeli forces. In the past few days, an investigation by the United Nations Human Rights Office has shown that the bullets that killed Shireen and injured her colleague, Ali Samoudi, were fired by Israeli forces. The New York Times published a detailed investigation into the killing of Shireen that relied on available video footage, witness testimonies, and an acoustic analysis of the bullets fired around the time Shireen was killed. The month-long New York Times investigation, published on June 20th, concluded that an Israeli soldier most likely fatally shot Shireen. The New York Times investigation stated no Palestinian armed men were near Shireen at the time she was killed, dismissing early Israeli theories blaming Palestinians for the incident. Previous reports by the Washington Post, the Associated Press, and the investigative group Bellingcat have also all concluded that Israeli forces likely killed Shireen. A CNN investigation last month also said evidence suggests that Shireen was killed in a targeted attack by Israeli forces. The United Nations, the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, the Associated Press, all confirming what we as Al Jazeera already know. These are all internationally well-known, respected organizations conducting their own investigation, their own reports, all coming to the same conclusion. So are we getting any closer to justice for Shireen? The Al Jazeera Media Network has gathered an international coalition of legal experts preparing a complete case dossier on the killing of Shireen to be submitted to the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court in The Hague. The case file includes the Israeli bombing and total destruction of the tower building in Gaza, which housed Al Jazeera's office, an event that took place in May 2021, almost a year to the day before the killing of Shireen. We as Al Jazeera need an independent, and we demand an independent and transparent investigation into the killing of Shireen to reveal the details of what happened. Let the truth be known and let the perpetrators be exposed. Al Jazeera demands accountability for the killing of its reporter. She was not killed in a crossfire. She was targeted. Those responsible for her assassination need to be held accountable. Al Jazeera demands justice for Shireen. She's often referred to as the daughter of Palestine. Shireen was cruelly shot dead while doing her job as a journalist. As civilians, journalists are protected under international humanitarian law against direct attacks. Violations of this rule constitute a grave breach of the Geneva Conventions. Furthermore, intentionally directing an attack against a civilian amounts to a war crime under the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. Al Jazeera calls for an end to impunity for crimes against journalists, all journalists. Journalists play a critical role in reporting facts, creating an informed citizenry. And so impunity for attacks against them has a particularly damaging impact, limiting public awareness and constructive debate. Democracy is threatened when journalists are attacked. Attacks on the freedom, the profession, and the practitioners of the media are increasing around the world at the very moment when the need for professional journalism is greater than ever. Just think of the last few days and weeks. The Rappler news site in the Philippines ordered to shut down. The seemingly inexcusable arrest of an Indian journalist, Mohammed Zubair. The murder of British journalist Dom Phillips in the Amazon. The need for journalism is greater than ever because journalists have a critical role to play in reporting and informing us all about what is happening in the world, about injustices, conflicts, hardships, corruption, rising ideologies of xenophobia, the climate emergency. Yet journalism cannot play this crucial civic role if our reporters are being killed, our offices bombed, and our freedom to publish and broadcast trampled. It's critical for all of us that journalism is not silenced, suppressed, or sidelined anywhere in the world. As the saying goes, democracy dies in darkness. So are we closer to getting any justice for Shireen? The answer still hangs in the balance. But Al Jazeera vows to follow every path to achieve justice for Shireen and to ensure those responsible for her killing are brought to justice and held accountable. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gilles Trendle, Managing Director of Al Jazeera English. And now we will go to Lina Abu Akleh. Lina is the niece of Shireen Abu Akleh. The floor is yours, Lina.
Hello.
Yes, it should work.
Hello, everyone. While everyone knows Shireen as the journalist, she was more than that. She was my one and only aunt. She was my best friend, and she was my second mother. We are a very small family, only 6 members. Now we're only 5. Despite how difficult her job was, she was always there to support us in every way possible. Her dedication extended beyond her job. She was also dedicated and committed to our family. I remember I used to wait on Shireen to return from work. so I can hear about her experiences and the stories from the field. As her niece, I was always worried for her, but she would reassure me that we are journalists. We are protected. Don't worry. But on May 11th, I woke up to the worst news of my life. My aunt was killed in Jenin. The bullet that killed her changed our entire lives forever. As a family, we are still grieving, still mourning, and still in utter disbelief that our one and only Shireen is no longer with us. Not once did I imagine that she would be the breaking news and not the one breaking the news. We are forever grateful to the outpour of love and support we received and continue to receive. Every day since she was killed is May 11th for me and for my family. Shireen was killed doing what she loved most, speaking the truth and giving voice to the silenced and voiceless Palestinians from all over Palestine. She was a symbol of courage, strength, and bravery. She used her voice to talk about the truth and uncover the crimes of Israel. But she also used her voice and compassion to humanize Palestine. She was also a role model to young women in Palestine and in the Arab world, as she was able to shatter the gender norms. When they killed Shireen, they thought that they can silence her and kill the voice of Palestine, but they didn't. Her death ended up casting a bigger light, not only on the crimes of Israel, but on how the Western world and international community has been covering up for Israel's crimes. Even during her funeral, she was still reporting, and that is a proof that her voice was stronger than any Israeli bullet. Shireen wasn't killed once, and I will always say this. She was killed twice. Once in Jenin refugee camp on May 11th, and the second time at the St. Joseph French Hospital in Jerusalem, when the Israeli police, armed to teeth, attacked the mourners, pallbearers, with the intent of dropping the coffin in a gruesome and barbaric manner. It was a traumatizing experience, to say the least, especially that I was there in the front lines, threatened to be beaten if I didn't move out of the way. The scenes outside of the hospital seemed like a war zone. They tried to put constraints on the funeral procession, and they didn't want Palestinian flags. I still failed to fathom how the funeral was a threat. From the morning, the Israeli occupation police confronted us. They were putting multiple checkpoints on the way to the hospital. So many people were unable to make it to the hospital and be present to mourn her. The hearse was also attacked. I remember her casket arrived to church covered in shattered glass. The attack on her funeral is a crime in and of itself, a crime against her dignity and our right to give Shireen a proper funeral. Israel's assassination of Shireen falls into a long-standing and well-documented Israeli pattern of targeting and inciting against Palestinian journalists and all journalists for that matter. This is deliberate crime. This deliberate crime is the result of decades of Israeli impunity and the international community's failure to hold Israel accountable. By killing Shireen, they are sending a message to all journalists. They're trying to silence the voice of peace and the truth about what's happening in Palestine, knowing that they are able to get away. This is a pattern, and she is not the first journalist to be killed, and unfortunately, not the last. I am here along with the Al Jazeera team to hand over the legal memorandum prepared by Al Jazeera's international lawyers to the High Commission for Human Rights, the Special Rapporteur on Promotion of the Right to Freedom of Opinion and Expression, and the President of the UN Human Rights Council. We continue to call for justice and for international community to hold Israel accountable and put an end to this impunity. Shireen was a Palestinian-American Christian female journalist. While we are thankful for the efforts and the support that the U.S. has provided us with, we still call on the U.S. to take action and hold Israel accountable and carry out an independent, transparent, and swift investigation. The evidence is clear. She was clearly targeted and killed by Israel. Shireen was a U.S. citizen, and it is their obligation to protect their citizens abroad and uphold the values of freedom, of press freedom that they continuously preach. Only a few days before Shireen's murder on May 3rd, President Biden released a statement on the Press Freedom Day. And in it, he stated that the importance of protecting journalists, especially women journalists in the field, since they are a minority. I still don't understand why Shireen is an exception. Why Shireen's case is still not being taken seriously by the US. The US has a duty to recognize her for the champion of truth that she was. And we continue to call for an independent investigation by all organizations. And I also call for Shireen's killing to be included within the Commission of Inquiry. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lina, for these words. And now we go to Barbara Triunfi. You're the Executive Director of the International Press Institute. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you for having us here today and for joining this press conference. From IPI, we have decided to join Al Jazeera and the IFJ in this visit to Geneva, to the UN Human Rights Council here, because as it has been highlighted by the two speakers before me, the events surrounding the killings of Shireen Abu Akleh are absolutely appalling. And the failure of the UN and its member states to take action is of profound concern, and most importantly, in breach of the commitments that UN members have repeatedly made to protect journalists and to end impunity in crimes against journalists. Indeed, the killing of Shireen is sadly one of many journalists killed this year. IPI has counted at least 35 so far. However, it is particularly disturbing for two reasons. As Giles mentioned, we have seen the initial efforts by Israel to deny any responsibility in her killing, and only after a series of highly respectable news outlets, the New York Times, CNN, Bellingcat were mentioned, among others, clearly showed that the bullet came from Israeli soldiers. Only then Israel acknowledged that, to my understanding, that's the status today, that the bullet came from their side. However, what some of the news outlets have also highlighted, Bellingcat in particular, did a fantastic investigation. They concluded that the gunshots were both aimed and deliberate. And this is something that obviously it requires further investigation. The amount of data that international news organizations have access to is obviously very limited, and that's why we have been calling for investigations to be carried out by Israel itself. However, there is a good possibility that that Shireen was not only that she was not killed, not caught in the crossfire, but specifically targeted. Immediately after Shireen was killed, IPI and other civil society organizations, journalist network, immediately brought the case to the attention of the Media Freedom Coalition. The Media Freedom Coalition, for those who are not familiar with it, is one of the most recent efforts by a fairly small group of UN member states to restate the principles of journalism, safety, and media freedom, and really engage much more proactively than what they felt they could do within the UN framework. The case, as I said, was immediately brought to their attention. Even there, we have yet to see any action. It is possible that something is happening behind, through diplomatic means, but definitely we haven't seen any public statement about that. And shortly after that, 34 civil society organizations and journalist group called for, also issued a statement condemning the killing and called for a number of actions. Obviously, mostly is for Israel to conduct an independent, transparent investigation and including international experts, which follow the UN protocol for investigations into human rights abuses. This has not happened so far. They called for, we, including IPI and others, for an international task force to investigate the attacks. So basically create an international task force. The Human Rights Council investigation so far is a first step, but definitely we need a much more thorough investigation there. And we took as example the precedent set by the investigation carried out by the UN Special Rapporteur Agnes Kalamar some years ago in the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, a very brave step from the Special Rapporteur. Obviously, certainly we also called on the International Criminal Court to conduct an investigation and determine whether Shireen's killings amounts to a war crime under the Rome statute of the ICC. And obviously, as Lina has said, for governments and UN member states, allies of Israel and others, to hold Israel accountable to its international obligations. I repeat, UN member states have signed a number of declarations, resolutions, and other international mechanisms that clearly recognize their responsibility in ensuring that an end to impunity in attacks against journalists, not only attacks that happen in their own countries, but also attacks that happen somewhere else. There is a commitment there to do everything in their power to end impunity, and yet, as other speakers have highlighted, we have seen very little action so far. No need to repeat that the widespread impunity obviously strengthens the perception that perpetrators of crimes against journalists face no judicial consequences, and as such, it becomes a very easy way to silence journalists or anybody who reports the facts, like Shireen did. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Barbara Triumphi, Executive Director of the International Press Institute, IPI. And now we go to Jim Boumelia.
That's right.
Jim, you're the Honorary Treasurer of the International Federation of Journalists, coming straight from London today, or yesterday. I give you the floor.
Okay, thank you, and thank Al Jazeera, for organizing this press conference and the events at the Human Rights Council. The International Federation of Journalists is a trade union representing 600,000 journalists globally, and that means that we have in membership some 180 unions in almost kind of 150 countries. And I just want to give a little bit of a context and what we're doing about the killing of Shireen and what we do generally about the killing of journalists all over the world. But journalists in Palestine are our members. And Shireen, in fact, was one of our members through her affiliation to the Palestine Journalists Syndicate. And we have been engaged in supporting and dealing with their problems for almost 40 years. These problems, they vary from bread and butter issues to professional issues to issues of press freedom, and most importantly, to issues of safety. And we have a massive historical knowledge of what happens to them almost on a daily basis. We have a massive database of what Palestinian journalists face almost daily for doing their jobs as journalists, from being harassed to being pushed around to being beaten up to having their equipment smashed or being arrested, and to more serious act of being shot by rubber bullets or hit by stun grenades or by live ammunition and even be killed. Now, we have full confidence in our union, the Palestine Journalists Syndicate, in their monitoring of the attacks on journalists. And just a couple of snapshots. In 2019, the syndicate documented 760 rights violations, including 200 cases of physical assault, dozens of injuries, and at least 10 serious injuries by live ammunition. This is staggering. And I will give you another snapshot. It's not coming from a trade union, it's coming from the entrail of the UN itself. The UN Human Rights Commission of Inquiry did an inquiry some years ago, and they documented for the period of the inquiry from 13th of March to 31st of December 2018, 2 journalists killed in Palestine, 39 injured by live ammunition, even though all of them were wearing vests, marked press. And they concluded that Israeli snipers shoot journalists intentionally, despite the fact that they are seen as journalists. But it was not until the office of the prosecutor of the ICC on the 3rd of March 2021 confirmed that the ICC would initiate an investigation with respect to the situation in Palestine, and that would cover crime within the jurisdiction of the court. That opened new doors for many people. And they promised an investigation that will be conducted independently, impartially, and objectively. There is a bit of history to that because it took some years for the ICC to take that decision. First of all, they made a request to their own judges, the judges of the pre-trial chambers, for a ruling to clarify the territorial scope of the court's jurisdiction. And they came up with a majority that said that the court may exercise its criminal jurisdiction on the situation in Palestine, which extend to Gaza and to the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. So we have already been working with some of our lawyers to produce submission to UN agencies. In fact, we did 2 very important submissions, one to the UNSR on extrajudicial summary for arbitrary executive Dr. Anis Kalemar, and the other one was to the UNSR promotion and protection of freedom of opinion, Ms. Irene Khan. And I'm sorry to tell you that none of them even responded, even acknowledged the submission, and that was only kind of a few years ago. And that may be going in terms of discussion of what UN agencies and all the international institutions can do. This time we have another London chamber, that is Bindmans, and both Bindmans and the one that we used before, Doughty Street chamber, worked at drafting a submission to the ICC, which was delivered in April. And in this communication, we addressed the unlawful targeting of Palestinian journalists and civilians and civilian objects housing Palestinian media organizations by members of the Israeli Defense Force and other services. And we submitted it on behalf of 4 journalists or their families. 2 of them, Ahmed Abu Hussein and Yasser Murtaja, were killed by snipers during the March of Great Return in 2018. 2 others were maimed in different circumstances. One, Mu'ath Amarna, was shot in the eye while covering a protest in a village in North Hebron. And the other one, who was a very interesting case, Nidal Ashtia, is a freelance photographer. He was shot by a rubber bullet in the eye, and he was one of the few that sought legal remedies within the Israeli courts. And the defendant, the Israeli state, claimed immunity because they were pursuant to state liability code that provided the state of Israel will not be liable for damage or injury incurred during an IDF combat operation. And the judge of the Magistrates Court couldn't agree more and dismissed the case. So for those people who says you should go to seek legal remedies, the answer is there. The second case of cases regard the airstrikes that the Jazeera director kind of referred to, committed by IDF against 3 towers housing media in Gaza, including Al Jazeera and Associated Press. Airstrikes completely destroyed these towers, leaving dozens of families homeless and others seeing their business destroyed. And the third set that we only started after the tragic incident in May is that we are taking a case on behalf of Shireen Abu Akleh and also on behalf of her two colleagues, Ali Samoudi. Not many people talk about him, but he was also kind of shot in the back and he could have died. And another colleague, Shata Hanaisha, who miraculously escaped the shooting, and she was in the line of fire. So I just end up on a few points that we're using in our argument. There is the question of the war crimes, and in our communication to the ICC prosecutor, we submit that the targeting of individual journalists give rise to reasonable grounds to suspect that the IDF commanders and soldiers have committed war crimes of willful killing and willfully causing serious injuries to bodies or health. And regarding the targeting and airstrikes committed against the towers, we say that there are reasonable ground to conclude that they constitute war crimes, attacking civilian population and attacking protected objects. On the question of crimes against humanity, and for all this period, the systematic and widespread targeting of journalists by the IDF result in killing and maiming of large numbers of journalists constitute, in our view, crimes against humanity, contrary to Article 7A of the Rome Treaty. And journalists are directly targeted by snipers, and it raised concern that contrary to the purported rule of engagement, what is committed is part of a state policy to silence the Palestinian media. Finally, just a couple of points. We submitted that this case is satisfied the requirement of the Rome Statute concerning issues of admissibility, and it should be admitted. We also submit that Israeli has consistently failed, and it has been raised over and over again. And when you look at all the past inquiry, they have failed to investigate the targeting and the use of legal force against journalists. So what we are requesting briefly are that the ICC open a criminal investigation. They've got the legal ground to do it. All the submission, and apart from our submission, Al Jazeera is going to do its own submission, the Palestinian Authority is doing submission. There are hundreds of other submissions that have been sitting at the ICC even before the court took the decision to admit cases in Palestine. All of this must be investigated. It is very strange that the prosecutor started immediately investigating what's going on in the Ukraine. And there is nothing wrong with it because they should be doing it. But at the same time, they should be sending investigators to Israel as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jim. From the International Federation of Journalists. And now we go to the questions. So if there are questions in the room, don't hesitate to raise your hands. And you also can, those who follow us on Zoom, also can ask their questions raising their electronic hand. So is there any questions in the room or on Zoom? One question there. Please tell your name and organization.
Taha Youssef, Global Media News. Is any legal action will be taken for this issue?
Any legal action, meaning that if a court has been court action has been taken, where do you mean, on which ground? International court, national court, where?
Yeah, legal action, like for example, Al Jazeera asked the court to, like that, something like that.
I'm not sure about the question because which court you're referring to. I just explained at great length what has been done with regard to the International Criminal Court. And the Al Jazeera director, talked as well about the file being prepared specifically to go to the International Criminal Court. There is a question of, I tried to explain what's happening locally on the question of legal remedies, because there's always this question before you go international, have you tried, the Israeli court? And on the Israeli court, there have been also kind of quite a slew, of court cases, and none of them came to very much. I mean, one of the people that we've got among the cases that the IFJ is taking there is precisely to prove that point. There's somebody, I don't know whether they had faith in the Israeli court or not, but he went through the process. And he went through the process, and at the end of the day, the odd was stacked against him, and it was very much the case that the system of accountability within Israel is quite shaky. And there have been, so many inquiries that have come out with chapter and verse of how that system works. So going to the court there do not always kind of take you anywhere. So at the moment, the only one that is in front of us is the ICC. Now, what's happening in other national courts, I'm not a lawyer, and I don't know what would happen if you take these cases to a German court or to a British court. That hasn't been tried, and I'm sure that if the avenue is open, it would have been done by now.
Do you want to add anything on that? Okay, thank you. Is there another question? If not, I'd like to just ask you one question. What about your stay here in Geneva? You came here today for this press conference, and then you're going to the UN. What are your expectations, and what type of action do you take at the UN here in Geneva?
Sure. So we will have a public event at the UN today, as well as individual meetings with with Ms. Irene Khan, as well as with the chair of the UN Human Rights Council. Yes, Irene Khan. Yeah, exactly. So, as I highlighted, I think that what we see here so clearly is an absolute failure of the mechanisms that we have in place to address this type of crimes. We have created a system, a post-war system, that is specifically intended to make sure that, first of all, journalists can operate safely, and that in case they are attacked, that the perpetrators are brought to justice. And I said there are a number within the UN, as well as within other international organizations, but within the UN there are a number of mechanisms that, and principles and commitments that have been repeated over and over. In November, we will celebrate the 10 years anniversary of the UN Plan of Action on Safety of Journalists. This was a major project of the UN that saw the cooperation of various UN agencies together with civil society, together with journalists and so on, which started 10 years ago exactly because we felt that more needed to be done to address crimes against journalists. 10 years later, we have made very little progress. And the feeling is that today the UN and these mechanisms are weaker than ever before. So the expectation or the ask or the conversation will be very often conversations with people like the Special Rapporteur and so on, to understand what can be done. What else can be done to make sure that there isn't a perception that these mechanisms that we have worked to create aren't entirely useless.
Thank you. Do you share this analysis of the UN mechanism that are not fulfilling, if I understand, all what they could do, at least? They should do.
Well, it depends very much how you want to look at it. Yes, there are hundreds of documents, of instruments, as they call them. Even now, I think the UN Human Rights Council is having a new inquiry that's just been set up recently to inquire about 20 years of inquiries and what happened to them. And that is very much how shaky, the edifice is. And I talked about Irene Khan. We submitted a very important submission to she could at least acknowledge it. or to say, piss off, I'm not going to talk to you. But she said nothing. How could you have faith in somebody that is there to protect freedom of expression, and they receive a submission on behalf of 600,000 journalists, and they don't even reply? Now, having said that, I am optimistic. I'm not one of those who says, no, you turn your back on them because it is a hopeless cause. No, I believe in the right of law. I believe that we've got institutions that we have to make them work, and we will work very hard, in order to make them work. I think the situation today, the fact that they come up with their own inquiry, is also kind of a source of optimism. It's good that they've done so, but at the same time, you could see, that kind of double standard. Why is it that Karim Khan, okay, we'll see what he's going to do with all these dozens and dozens of cases going to be in front of him, but immediately he jumped into the Ukraine. As I said, Ukraine is absolutely horrendous situation. It should be investigated. They should send people there to have looked what's going on and take action against, the perpetrators of crimes against all kinds of people, not just journalists. But why is it they don't do it in Israel? And that is really kind of a question that if we all get together and press it, every day, I'm sure that sometimes, things would start moving.
Thank you. Perhaps a question to Lina Abu Akleh. Can you tell us a little bit, how do you live the situation now in Jerusalem? You coming from Jerusalem. In your family, do you feel threatened in a way or another? The tensions were very high. How was it going on today?
Yeah, thank you for that question. As I mentioned earlier, we're still in disbelief. It's definitely shocking that we had to experience this. And then the situation was definitely more tense. Considering the challenges we received from the Israeli side. But currently we're on the ground trying to exhaust all measures, trying to use all our options and channels to hold Israel accountable. And as it's been mentioned, we don't trust and we don't even expect anything from the Israeli courts, considering their track record in cases like this. That's why we're putting our optimism, and Shireen was a very, very optimistic person. She was always hopeful that this occupation will end. So I am trying to feed off from that optimism and hope that something positive will come out of it. But back to your question, in Jerusalem now we're still there are still so many events, so many memorials, tributes honoring Shireen, and that goes on to show how much she impacted the people in Palestine and how much they loved her and wanted to respect her. So until today, we still have ongoing events honoring her, different ceremonies trying to make sure that her name is not forgotten and that her story is not another number. It's another story that will be in the headlines, and then that's it. We move on to the next story. So we will continue pressuring. We'll continue to call on everyone to take action, and it's their responsibility to hold Israel accountable.
Thank you. Perhaps a question to Giles Trendle. Can you hear us?
Yes.
How is Al Jazeera today? What's the situation for Al Jazeera today on the field? Has the conditions of working changed? Do you take some different precautions? Are you threatened? Do you feel threatened in a way or another? How is it there?
Unfortunately, Al Jazeera has had a long history of having faced difficulties in doing our jobs. Shireen was the 12th journalist who's been killed since the beginning of Al Jazeera 25 years ago. And over that period of time, we've had so many journalists imprisoned, detained. I think maybe you have in the room there in Geneva one of my colleagues who was in Guantanamo Bay, the only journalist to be held in Guantanamo Bay without charge, no charges. So we've had a tough experience, but we're determined, as always, when we're determined to seek justice and accountability for the killing of Shireen. As I said, to address the first question that came to you, we are seeking to submit to the International Criminal Court in The Hague. We're addressing the legal issue. I note that as Jim said, there have been many cases before and many submissions before. We have to keep going down that route. I agree with Barbara as well that there is a failure in some of these mechanisms, but they're the mechanisms that we have, and we have to keep trying. And all I would say is that justice cannot only be applied or pursued when it's politically expedient. Justice should be equal and across all cases, and not just when it suits certain parties. But Al Jazeera is committed to continuing and supporting the family and doing what we can in all avenues to pursue justice and accountability over the killing of Shireen.
Meaning that you felt directly targeted as Al Jazeera in this case, and you think that you're really not welcome as a media there?
Well, as I said before, we were targeted along with others in the strike on the building a year before in May 2020. We have had journalists targeted many times in Palestine, and we believe that Shireen was the latest case in that example.
Just one more question, perhaps to you or Lina. You said, Lina, that you don't expect anything from the Israeli courts, but does it mean that you have not taken action now in the Israeli courts because you don't expect anything, or what's the situation exactly?
Yes, so far we haven't taken any action, and we're still trying to study the situation better. But again, we've seen the narrative from the Israeli side. They changed their narratives around, 7 times. They continue to escape guilt and not take responsibility for their action once again. So we are not hopeful from anything that comes out of them, but we're still trying to study all our options and assess what's the best possible outcome to get justice for Shireen and hold them accountable.
There's one question from the views of the Israeli side, is that they say, okay, we need more to investigate more this case. We are ready to do it, but we need one thing: it's the bullet, to know from what type of rifle it came. And the Palestinian authorities don't seem, but that's what they say, don't want to give that bullet to them for the investigation. So what's the reason why the bullet should not be given, or that you don't want to give the bullets to them?
Well, the investigation that was conducted by the Palestinian Authority was transparent, it was independent, and it was conducted on international standards. So it is reliable. And why won't the Israelis provide the Palestinians with the rifle? Why do they continue to discredit the results of the investigations? And all evidence clearly is pointing towards Israel. So they trying their best to find ways to escape that guilt and blame it on the Palestinians, that they're the ones who who are not giving the bullet. But at the end of the day, they know who did it. They have the situation room. They have a chain of command, so they are sure that it was their side, but this is their way of covering it and putting the blame on Palestinians on Palestine for not giving them the bullet.
So this international Palestinian and international investigation showed very clearly what type of bullet it was, and this is opened, and we know that.
Yes, they showed the bullet. It was also broadcasted by Al Jazeera. They showed the picture of the bullet, and it is clear that this is a bullet that's used by Israeli forces. Okay.
Do you want to add anything? I know. Barbara?
Maybe just to stress, this is exactly the reason why we're calling for a transparent investigation which involves international actors. Because clearly there is, for obvious reason, there is no trust between Israel and Palestine. Why should it? And so that's why it requires the intervention of international actors, either as part of the investigation or as part of a completely separate investigation, but having access to the data that both sides currently hold. So, yeah.
Just very briefly, now we're getting into the macro of what to do and the different ideas and perspective of different people. I mean, the issue of international actors is so nebulous that we don't think, although it'd be great if there are other inquiries, that are set up. It is unfortunate that the one coming from Palestine was not welcomed by international media. They didn't look into it. They didn't scrutinize it. They didn't ask questions. They just ignored it as if it didn't happen because it was coming from the other side. But we still think that the ICC is the body to do it. The ICC is a court, is an international court. It's got a basis in international law and so on and so forth. And I think just either talking about having the United States institute their own investigation because Shireen was American, or any other kind of variation, just tend to completely exhaust, the kind of the subject, and maybe in a few months people would have forgotten about it. On the question of when Israel owns up to things, there have been cases when they paid, without, of course, admitted any culpability. My own colleagues in the UK, James Miller, was killed some years ago, and Israel dragged their feet. The official inquiry said nothing happened, we don't even know him, and so on and so forth. All the stupid things that they put in this kind of inquiries, but at the end of the day, they paid money for it. And that is a fact, without admitting culpability. So, and I think not many people even noticed that. And that will show you very much how that system of accountability works.
Thank you.
I just want to add. And also, James Miller was killed under similar circumstances as Shireen. He was wearing a press vest. He also presented himself to the army and told them, I am a journalist. So it's under the same circumstances. That's why we don't trust their investigation. And it's not just about a payout or a settlement. Israel should be held accountable and it should be held responsible, not just the soldier, but the entire chain of command and the entire system that continues to target journalists, target civilians. It's the entire system as a whole. And it's important to also note that few days after Shireen was killed and after the funeral, there was the flag march in Jerusalem. And right-wing Israeli settlers, they were actually chanting and celebrating the killing of Shireen. They were saying, Shireen is dead, Shireen is dead. And that is part and parcel of the Israeli state-sanctioned violence. And that is happening because Israel is not held accountable. So when they see that their state is actually killing and targeting journalists, then the civilians, the settlers, the right-wing settlers, they go on and enjoy and celebrate this kind of crime.
Thank you. Jim just said before that actually the international medias didn't really do their job covering the reports and the investigation of the international investigation, Palestinian investigation about this killing. My question to Giles is, do you think that the other medias are failing in covering this precise case that is involving a very specific media?
I believe in the first few days there were some unfortunate headlines. For example, one of the headlines in a major media organization was "Palestinian journalist dies." So there were some unfortunate headlines. I think since then, as we've seen with some of the thorough investigations done by some of the really credible international media, that many organizations are recognizing that this is a situation that needs to be investigated more by higher bodies than media organizations can do. And again, I go back to the point, that's why Al Jazeera demands an independent, comprehensive investigation. I think your question about the bullets, I think it's understandable that you can't share evidence with one of the parties that is a suspect, a main suspect. And so again, that needs a comprehensive, independent, international investigation.
But coming back to my questions, do you think media should put more pressure? We know that governments react on media when there is a lot of pressure. Do you think that in case medias, international medias that have power, should do more about that?
I think all of us as media and journalists, we have to stand up for and show solidarity with any journalist that is killed, attacked, imprisoned unfairly and without reason, without charge. It's up to all media organizations. I know Al Jazeera has had a lot of support in the past from many media organizations. And in this particular case, I think it's very important that in such a clear case, a seemingly clear case, as has been proved, that media organizations come together and show solidarity for all journalists.
Thank you. Is it difficult to mobilize medias, journalists in your organizations on this case?
No, I feel that, well, two things. First of all, I think that indeed comparing to other killings of journalists, Shireen's case received a lot of coverage, rightly so for the reasons that we said. And that major leading international news organizations started independent investigations into this is quite a unique thing. Fact is, the media is not there to bring about justice. The media is there to cover events, to expose injustice if we want and so on. But in the end, we need institutions to prosecute. And that is the part that is not happening. So I wouldn't blame the media in this case. I actually think that the media has given it quite a lot of coverage, and certainly from our membership, and I'm sure from IFJ's membership too, there was a lot of solidarity with Al Jazeera and with Shireen and Shireen's family in particular. But as I said, the media can only count to a certain point, and then you need state institutions and international institutions to step in.
Jim, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, just to say that there have been quite a lot of coverage, and there have been quite a lot of outpouring of sympathy by journalists and journalist organizations all over the world. And that is in a situation where journalists continue to be killed. So I don't think that colleagues make a hierarchy of victims, that one is more important than another. Yesterday in Mexico, another journalist has been killed, the 12th this year. So it's not a question of number crunching. It's the question of the raising of consciousness, how people perceive it, and when it becomes headline, of how important it will become. We just had the World Congress of the International Federation of Journalists about a few weeks ago in Oman, and there were 250 journalists representing 120 organizations. And the big chunk of that conference, they only meet every 3 years, and every single minute is absolutely precious, and a lot of it was spent on Shireen. Big presentation, and a lot of not only applaud, and the condition where people from Latin America were there, people who have had huge numbers of journalists dying, and they consciously, it's like if they try not to push, the cases of their own journalists in order for Shireen to be very much, the person that everybody talked about, and it captured the imagination of a whole Congress for the time that it took. So that is important, and I think that's the stage that we're going through. She will continue, with the case of Shireen, to reverberate absolutely everywhere, and the more we go with pursuing the case, the more that will reflect what's happening elsewhere in the world.
Thank you. Perhaps my last question to Giles. if we accept the evidence that the bullet come from the Israeli side, why would or has Israel targeted journalists, media? Is it, in your views, is it a kind of punishment, or is it to dissuade journalists to do their job and to cover the ongoing conflict in the area?
I think that's a question you have to ask the Israelis. I don't want to be evasive, but it's difficult for me to put myself in the head of the Israelis as to why they would target journalists. So that's a very good question, and it needs to be put to the Israelis. Okay, thank you. And a very last question to Lina. What do you expect today from your stay in Geneva for this 2 days here?
I expect cooperation. I expect that all representatives, organizations, delegations, they actually listen to our experience and listen to what we faced and what we went through for the past 50 days now. And I expect that they take action. We welcome all the condemnations, we welcome all the statements, but we also want to see action. And as it's been mentioned, the double standards is very stark and it needs to end. That's why I'm hoping that there is something positive and that the event that we're holding and all these talks will actually bring about something positive for our case, for Shireen also, and that we need action, we need justice. I hope it will be able to change something.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Lina Abou Akleh. You're again the niece of Shireen Akleh. Thank you to you, Giles Trendle, who from Managing Director of Al Jazeera that joined us by Zoom. Thank you to Barbara Triumphi, Executive Director of the International Press Institute. And thank you, Jim Bumela from the International Federation of Journalists. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.